Here's a rather different sort of a letter. In fact, it didn't come from Doughty Street. It was sent from Petersham, near Richmond, Surrey, where Dickens and the family had gone for a little relaxation, no doubt. It was sufficiently far from the centre of London for Dickens to be able to describe what they were doing as ruralising. But it's a different sort of a letter in another way too. This really concerns Dickens in his capacity as the editor of Bentley's Miscellany. And occasionally it must be that people approached Bentley's for private printing matters. And here is a certain Mrs. Godfrey, at least we think that's who it is, Mrs. Godfrey, who's approached them with a small volume of improving tales, which she's written, improving tales for children. And she wants them printed in a limited number for private distribution, which was obviously something that Bentley's did. And Dickens could so easily just have said, yes, splendid, thank you, it'll cost you 12 shillings and sixpence or whatever. But being who he was, and in full editorial mode, he cannot forbear from commenting on the actual stories themselves and offering advice. And more than that, he expresses himself very passionately, surprisingly passionately, on a certain theme. The two main issues in the letter are children and God. Now, children, of course, Dickens was deeply involved with, concerned with, had indeed created some of the most memorable children in literature already by that point. But God is another matter. We don't often think or talk about Dickens in terms of God, but in fact he was a deeply religious man. He claimed that he had prayed every single day of his life. He even wrote a life of Christ privately for his children. It was later published long after his death. But his views were very simple and characteristically individual. He definitely believed in God, and he deeply admired the figure of Jesus Christ and tried to follow his precepts in every way that he could. He had very little time for organized religion. For a while he was a Unitarian, which means a very tiny amount of external trappings and no clergy, for example. He simply gathered with his fellow Unitarians to contemplate the Gospels together. But here he expresses himself with fascinating passion on the subject. Anyway, here's the letter. It was written on the 25th of July, 1839, and it comes from Elm Cottage in Petersham. My dear madam, the tales you have sent me will be quite sufficient in point of quantity to make the little book for your own distribution, in which I will immediately have them printed for you. Indeed, I would suggest the omission of the tale about the pin cushion, as it does not seem to me very likely to please, and you will have quite enough for your purpose without it. There is some want of explanation concerning Brownwing himself and the little girls to whom he addresses his tales. That, if you please, I will supply. Very few words will render this quite intelligible to children, and as I have marked the passages where they appear to be wanted, I can perhaps set this right more readily than you could. In acknowledging the receipt of your parcel and requesting you to let me know whether you will like your name in the little title page and the addition, as I suppose you will, of the name of your school, I feel it necessary to suggest to you whether you do not think there are some passages in the story The Loss of Beauty which are calculated, and very naturally so, to give offence to the very class of persons with whom you desire to stand well, whether it does not appear to be designed more for the correction of parents than for the instruction of children, whether the points about the grandmamma do not touch upon very delicate ground, and one upon which there is always more or less of sore feeling in families where there is a grandmamma, and whether the teaching children, who always apply stories to their own cases, to decide so positively in her favour against their own parent is exactly judicious and very likely to create a prepossession in your own favour. You should be a better judge of this than I, but I know you will rather thank me than be displeased for mentioning these duds, as they have occurred to me on reading your tales. There is one other point upon which I have at all times and in all cases so strong and violent a feeling that, although I do not ask you to make any alteration, for my opinions are peculiar, I dare say, and quite as likely to be wrong as yours, I cannot forbear expressing my opinion on it. I do most decidedly object, and have a most invincible and powerful repugnance to that frequent reference to the Almighty in small matters, which so many excellent persons consider necessary in the education of children. I think it monstrous to hold the source of inconceivable mercy and goodness perpetually up to them as an avenging and wrathful God who, making them in his wisdom children before they are men and women, is to punish them awfully for every little venial offence which is almost a necessary part of that stage of life. I object decidedly to endeavouring to impress them with a fear of death before they can be rationally supposed to become accountable creatures. And so great a horror do I feel at the thought of imbuing with strict doctrines those who have just reflection enough to know that if God be as rigid and just as they are told he is, their fathers and mothers and 3/4 of their relations and friends must be doomed to eternal perdition. And if I were left to choose between the two evils, I would far rather that my children acquired their first principles of religion from a contemplation of nature and all the goodness and beneficence of the great being who created it, than I would suffer them with such strict construction ever to open a Bible or a prayer book, or enter a place of worship. I do declare to you, my dear madam, that I daily see such evil and misery springing up from this fatal mistake that whenever I see the slightest approach to it, I cannot in my conscience let it go by without my most solemn protest. I am always, dear madam, faithfully yours, Charles Dickens.